shout on, pray on, we're gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Welcome back to Eschatology Matters. I'm your host, Josh Howard, and I'm joined today by Dr. David Schrock for his second visit on Eschatology Matters. So, David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Josh. Good to be back.
So our first chat, we were just discussing this. I think it was in the spring, but if anybody did not cover that, or excuse me, if anybody did not watch that chat or listen to it, if you're on a podcast, please go back and visit that initial chat. A lot of the stuff that we talked about, it's interesting the way these things pan out. But we talked about things like Christian nationalism, theonomy, some of those things. We talked a lot about your recent book on the priesthood. But I would encourage everybody to go back, catch that initial chat. But David, would you just give a little brief bio introduction? You're a pastor, you're an author, you're obviously a pro Michigan, or you're for Michigan football, which makes
football.
Yeah, a little bio, brother.
That's an interesting thing going on right now these days. But so I'm a pastor in Northern Virginia, a place called Occoquan Bible Church. Been here for 8 years. Before that, pastored in Indiana, Southern Indiana. When I was there, began working with Indianapolis Theological Seminary. So I teach theology there, go back and do classes there throughout the year. And then about a year ago, maybe just a little bit more than a year ago, a number of us began this project called Christ Overall, which is a website that provides monthly content, biblical, theological, cultural, for the church, thinking through matters. And it just so happens we're talking about Christian nationalism this month and actually spilling into next month, month of November.
No, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been encouraging, and I would put this out here. If anybody's not following, there's certain ministries like Founders Ministries that I've long recommended to others. But Christ Overall, if you're not following Christ Overall, please give them a follow. Please check out their material. It's one of those things where you guys consistently put out such solid and good material that I'm kind of waiting for you guys to have a bad week. You put out so much, it's really hard to keep it all on point. It's so good, though. It's so encouraging, and some really impactful topics. You guys have covered Genesis, creationism, and now you've jumped into the non-controversial realm of Christian nationalism.
Non-controversial, absolutely.
Yeah. Why Christian nationalism? Obviously, it's a hot topic, but what made you guys decide to engage it?
Well, I think it's been a conversation in the works for the last couple of years, right? I mean, so certainly the relationship between church and state is not new in America, not new in churches in America, certainly even church history. But January 2021, right, the issue that related to January 6th and just the accusations of Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, was being brought from, this is a term of derision from the media. And so Christians have been responding to that. And then some of them kind of taken that label and said, yeah, that's exactly what we are. We're Christian. We're for our nation. And so there's been a lot of confusion about what that actually means, what it doesn't mean. You have just a proliferation of books that are arguing against it, arguing for it. And we've just been kind of watching that debate and conversation take place and think, okay, Christ overall. I mean, we certainly believe that Christ is over our nation and all nations, and we want to think about that. And so hopefully we can provide a platform for brothers, faithful brothers, to be able to speak to these things, and so that people can hear what is going on, to hear the different perspectives, and Lord willing, try to bring some synthesis to that, some evaluation of that. We certainly don't believe we have the final word on it, but we want to be helpful with what this conversation is debating these days.
Yeah, no, it's much appreciated, David. Honestly, we've been so encouraged to see it. Anytime you have, we can observe at the front end. Twitter is not real life, right? So what happens on Twitter is not real life. Praise God for that. But there's a lot of talking past one another. There's a lot of, like you said, people jumping in and using a label, perhaps that doesn't mean what other people think it does. Tell me this, David. So we're recording this on Reformation Day, which thank you again for joining me on Reformation Day. I didn't realize we'd scheduled you for a holiday. No, but when you guys have been working through this, where are you guys at currently as far as the release schedule goes? What's coming ahead, and also what sort of nuances maybe are you starting to pick up on? I don't want to steal your thunder. Obviously, I encourage everybody to go listen to those interviews, but what are some of the things that are kind of emerging for you guys?
Yeah, so I think one, there's far more agreement than disagreement among those that we have talked to, right? I think everybody is for the gospel, is for the church, is for the nation in which they stand. how they put all those things together. Obviously, there are differences that are there. That relates to the difference between a Presbyterian and a Baptist understanding, how the covenants are going to work out. What is the relationship between church and state? There'll be differences that are there. But I think we've been encouraged by most of the conversations and the depth of which people are thinking about these things. Certainly, you have some who are thinking at a more theoretical level and trying to do more of a church historical piece to be able to help us to think through how has the church thought through this, how have Christians in America thought through this, and then others who are more practical and try to actually bring change, trying to get rid of one regime and to put in a new regime. And certainly that leads to all kinds of conversation about what's the best way to do that. But I think we've learned quite a bit on that. So just where we are in the schedule. So yesterday was Tom Askell. We released it. So all of them are recorded now that we've done. Tomorrow will be Timon Klein. Scott Aniel will come after that. Jonathan Lehman, Al Mohler. So that was fun to be able to talk to the president of Southern Seminary and just to be able to hear some of his perspectives on that, and maybe even some things that we weren't anticipating in that conversation. So that should be a good conversation that is coming forward. And so then from there, we'll begin to try to analyze and think through what's a Baptist political theology. What is a Baptist view of the nation? So the language that we're going to probably use in the month of November is not so much Christian nationalism, where we're either for it nor against it, but something that we actually picked up in our conversation with Joe Boot and Andrew Sandlin, just talking about biblical nationhood, right? So instead of just trying to define, is this nation Christian or not? And of course, there's all sorts of divisions and debates on what that even means. Say, how does the Bible instruct us to think about nations? So throughout the Bible, nations are there. This is one of the points of debate now. Do nations come after the fall with respect to Babel and the different languages that are there? That would be the way that I would be inclined to read the scriptures. You have others, someone like a Stephen Wolfe, who's going to put nations before the fall, and that's part of nature. And so that is going to lead to very different ways of understanding the world, the nature and grace distinction that he brings out there. But those are some of the things we're going to do and try to have biblical, theological, a little bit more cultural application in the month of November. And again, what we're going to call it is toward biblical nationhood, not because we're going to come to a final conclusion. We certainly don't think that we will solve all the problems. We absolutely will not. We may cause others. But we want to at least to say, here's a Baptist way of presenting these things that is going to be faithful, is going to be bold, that is going to challenge people to be faithful in the public square and not to shy away from those things.
Okay, no, that's helpful. And I'm kind of skipping ahead, but I'm curious because you said you were going to be presenting a sort of statedly Baptist approach to this idea, which is a good to kind of lay the cards on the table. I'm curious what sort of maybe specific nuances or what will affect your approach coming from a Baptist perspective, because just kind of give you some context. We have heard certain voices that have quite loudly insisted that Baptists can or cannot be certain things, and drawing certain lines that other Baptists are then competing with. So I'm curious, like what's your approach as far as a Baptist approach to this?
Yeah, I mean, so I think among the guys that are Christ overall, I don't think any one of us would be post-millennial. So we're not going to be presenting that, but I think at least one of the brothers who's going to be writing for us is post-millennial. So we're not opposed to that, right? But just thinking through that, I think that does have an impact on the way that we think about the mission of the church. So we would prioritize the mission of the church as making disciples, but then those disciples are sent out into the world, into different areas of vocation to fulfill their calling, to be light in those places. And so they should be bringing things that they learned from the church into those ways. So that would be different than, let's say, just the way that Stephen Wolfe and Doug Wilson have thought about the need to see nations transformed. We want that too. But we don't believe that there's a promise in the scripture that is going to happen. It will happen. It may happen. It certainly happened in America's history. One of the things we talked about with John Wilsey, who's a historian, is the different ways that different kinds of Christian nationalism were brought together over the course of American history. And with Mark David Hall, there's certainly the recognition that our founding had deeply Christian ideas in the roots of it. Even if it wasn't founded to be a theocratic nation, so to speak, it certainly was impacted deeply by Christianity. And so we do believe that Christians should be seeking to see the secondary impact of the gospel in the place that they live, whether that is locally or nationally. But we're not we don't believe guarantee that is going to necessarily happen in that way. So that might be different than a post-millennial understanding of that.
Okay.
I think I think the other thing is not establishing a religion, so to speak. So taking the nation to then be establishing those things. And there's all sorts of different ways that we've had conversations, we'll continue to have these conversations about, well, what role do the Ten Commandments, do natural law play? Does the scripture play in the nation? And, I like the language, at least one of our guests on our podcast has said that we should be affirming the first table of the law, even if we're not enforcing the first table of the law. Because even in scripture, that language it's common to have first table, second table, the vertical aspects of the Ten Commandments and the horizontal aspects that are there. But really, in scripture, you can't divide those two things, right? That might be a heuristic tool to be able to think through different ways that the law is applied. But really, the Ten Commandments, when they're given to Israel, they're all one. And so, yes, you have the two tablets that are there. I would follow Meredith Klein to understand that those are two copies of the same Ten Commandments, the law that is there. But I think there is a recognition that if you're only enforcing the second table, certainly we'd want to do that. But even then, if you cut off the source of that from the Bible, the source of that from God who reigns over all, you're going to miss the impetus and again the fear of God to actually bring those things into bear. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about in the next month.
Okay, no, that's really interesting, and I'm curious on two fronts on there.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you brought up the Baptist and then the amillennial postmillennial division. And obviously we know of some Baptists that are postmillennial, and we know some, so these are not neat divisions, right? And yet at the same time, in your engaging with this topic, and as the research has been ongoing, the conversations have been ongoing there at Christ Overall, have you encountered that to be at least a helpful distinction to see that most in the postmillennial camp are not following Baptist doctrines or falling into the Baptist camp? Is that a helpful way of looking at, because you mentioned amil postmill?
Yeah, sure.
But specifically coming from a Baptist perspective, is that typically going to not be postmillennial? How about that way of phrasing it?
So and this is my perspective. I think in some ways, Baptist post-mill seems to be something of a halfway house in between, right? It seems as though that position, I think I'm talking to Baptist post-mill, if I'm not mistaken, but
never used the titles, but yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay, fair enough. But thinking about that, right? I mean, it seems as though that postmillennialism does lead to something that is distinctive from a Baptist understanding of regeneration. Or if there is a strong understanding of regeneration in the local church, that postmillennialism is seeing something that is being transformative in the culture, that takes on the mission of the church, that maybe goes beyond just the making of disciples. It's actually then discipling the nations in such a way that now there's a promise to that nation to be transformed as well, in ways that, at least as I'm reading the scripture, I don't see that as much, right? So I can see that there certainly are historically, and even some today, I know Joel Webbin would be in this category, right? As someone who is Baptist and post-mill. For me, I just see that as somewhat incongruous. Maybe I just don't see it all. That's fair enough. But that seems to be something that there's a tension that seems to be there.
Okay, no, I like the way you're framing that with the tension, as opposed to saying one cannot be. One of our contributors, Tim Bashong, he would fall into the 1689 Baptist and yet still claiming the postmillennial label. Sure. So that would be helpful to walk through. So we've got Baptist, amillennial, postmillennial on one side. You'd also mentioned transformative culture as opposed to more of a legalization or achieving things through the power of the state. And this was where it was the second to last interview, as of the time of this recording anyway. You guys were chatting with Joe Boot and Andrew Sandlin. It's super helpful, super interesting. Even brought in Herman Doiverd, which is always a win when we can bring in Doiverd. But one of the things that you guys were talking about on there was culture being upstream from laws, or culture being upstream from politics and the legislation thereof. This is a really roundabout question, so sorry it's taking so long. But if we were looking at the CN debate, as at least it's been playing out on social media, a lot of the accusations are that it has to be top-down legislated, that people are trying to convert at the edge of the sword, that Christian nationalists in general, which again you've made clear that's a very big, broad camp, and yet they're trying to achieve conversions at the edge of the sword, or top-down legislation. What have you guys encountered as far as that? Or is that a fair assessment of those within the CN camp? Are you guys seeing more culture upstream of politics? What's been some of the findings so far?
Yeah. So I definitely think what you just described, by and large, is a caricature that is superimposed on those who they would see as theocratic fascist or something, right?
Yeah.
Christian nationalists. R.J. Rushdoony is a good example of this, and he was brought up in the conversation with Andrew Sandlin in particular, because Sandlin worked with Rushdoony for some 11 years or something to that end. And Rushdoony is often characterized as someone who, okay, we're going to use the law to force and to coerce people, in the law to then use the state to coerce people into Christian forms of life. And I think, I haven't read a ton of him, but what I've read, and certainly talking with Sandlin, it seems that is a misreading of him, certainly because he saw great concern for the state to have all kinds of power to be able to coerce people to do something. He would see that as a tyrannical state that the state should not have. And looking at the law in the Old Testament, it does seem to have something more of a local and limited sphere of authority that is there.
Mhm.
So certainly even historically, and this is one of the strengths of R.J. Rushdoony, is how much he did just historically. Whereas before, the idea of capital punishment used to be something that was far more local. And the individuals who were tasked with actually bringing someone to the gallows would have actually known them because they would have been neighbors. Where I live in Northern Virginia, our county has an old courthouse, and it's where the gallows were. And it was at those gallows in our county where executions would take place. And you think about that, whereas today, if there's going to be that kind of capital punishment at a federal level, well, the person who's pulling the lever on the electric chair has no idea who the person is in here, which is very different than the structures that you see scripturally or that would have been applied earlier in our nation's history, or some of the things that an R.J. Rushdoony would have been imposing with the law that is there, trying to take God's law and apply that. So I think this idea of taking the sword in order to coerce people is far more Islamic than it is something that Christians are going to use that sort of approach. If they do, they're no longer having biblical grounds to be able to do that. And so I think that would be one caricature that is put in place there.
No, I'm glad you're calling it a caricature and kind of walking through how that is a caricature, because that seems to have dominated so much of the conversation that, number one, anyone who suggests any sort of national repentance or national bowing the knee to Christ in any regard is automatically labeled a Christian nationalist, and then that caricature is applied, which just does a disservice to the whole conversation, I think. It's interesting when you were talking with Andrew Sandlin and he was kind of walking through a lot of Rushdoony. That was helpful, just insofar as to hear how Rushdoony himself has not been well read by many who are seemingly critiquing him, and I think you could probably say the same for Greg Bonson and many other who have come after him. Tell me this, David. So what's the intersection then of cultural Christianity with this whole conversation? We've talked about cultural Christianity a good bit, which again, the term itself needs some defining, and we could probably walk through that. But just the intersection of culture with Christianity, to the point where we have a culture that is sufficiently Christianized. I'm defining it. Walk us into that, David.
Yeah, so I think the conversation where that really came out for us was talking with Mark David Hall. So he's done quite a bit of historical work on the founding of America and just distinguishing the difference between cultural Christianity and a Christian culture. Right. And so cultural Christianity is this kind of nominal Christianity that, let's just say, in a country that has, that identifies itself as Christian, everyone that is born into that nation is therefore given the title of being a Christian. We see this probably in the Christendom of Europe in particular. And so I do think that can lead to a kind of nominalism that is there. So I would have some concerns about that. And I don't think that should be a goal that we as Christians would have. At the same time, I think a Christian culture is something that should be there. And this might be different from some Baptists who would say, if we're trying to focus on a Christian culture, the world around us, then we're misleading and missing what the mission of the church is. What's the mission of the church? Again, it's to make disciples. I agree with that. But if those disciples are actually proliferating, if they are growing, if they're raising up children in their homes and those children are coming to faith, and again, by the work of the Spirit, not by the work of just doing the Bible studies, whatever else that would be, they're catechizing in the homes, but if they're truly coming to faith in Christ, and then as they spread out into the culture, well, then we have Christians who are in the culture, and as they build businesses, as they work in schools, as they work in factories, wherever they are, there certainly is a way in which Christians are now having the opportunity, if they speak publicly and out loud from their faith, of what they're doing. And so in that regard, I think there can be something very positive about a Christian culture. And I wouldn't pull people back from saying that that is something that we should pray for and strive for. But that's still different, I would argue, from the mission of the church gathered, which is to make disciples. And so maybe, there's a way in which if you're only focusing on Christian culture, that it seems to water down that primary mission of evangelism, discipleship. But I don't see those two things as necessarily at odds with one another.
Right. No, it seems that should be, there's so often within theology or within just the Christian life that there seems to be a ditch on both sides of the road. It seems to just be a ditch on either side, to focus too much on culture or to neglect culture entirely, whereas culture should just be, I would think, part of that conversation of, if you have Christians doing Christian things, you're going to be building Christian culture with forethought to it.
And what that does then, I would say, does circle back to the life of the church, right? So if 1 Timothy 2 is telling us that we should pray for those in authority, the kings and those who are in authority, that we would be able to live peaceably. Well, then in our nation, where the governing body is the people themselves under the Constitution, then we should strive to see peace in our nation in such a way that the church is able to be free, and the church is able to continue to gather, to be able to share the gospel in public, right? So it seems as though there can be this kind of loser mentality at times that says the church is most pure when the culture is entirely against it. I mean, this is certainly the things we've heard from those like Russell Moore, who is celebrating the downfall of cultural Christianity. And I was in the room at that Southern Baptist meeting, I think it was in Columbus in 2015, where he said it is good that cultural Christianity is going away because the light and the darkness are distinct.
Right.
I don't think that that's the way that it needs to go. Right. Instead, we should be absolutely faithful, I would argue, with regenerate churches. So I'm a Baptist, to preach the gospel, to make disciples there. But when you have Christians who are in political spheres, when you have Christians who are judges, when you have Christians who are in these public arenas, then there should be the preservation of the culture in such a way that the churches can continue to flourish, because they're going to make zoning laws. Like right now, our church is struggling because we're growing and we don't have enough parking spaces. And so one of our challenges is to find parking spaces to build out our building. And talking with our county supervisor, there wasn't any willingness to have any conversation about some unused land right next to us that's owned by the state or owned by the county, because, that would be overreaching church and state. I was like, absolutely not. We could go to court about that. That doesn't seem to be the best strategy that is there. But here's someone who stands in the way of actually a church being able to fulfill its mission. So it makes sense then that Christians would be in those places and to call for elected officials who would be able to recognize that this is an actual good for the culture and for the community instead of an ill.
Mm-hmm. I wonder how this builds. When we talked last time, you'd brought up that it seems that a lot of the a lot of the vitriol, a lot of the heat in these conversations is a Christian circle, which is we've been grappling with the fact that we've been kind of riding on the I can't remember the term you used, but essentially the detritus of our former culture, which was at least favorable to Christianity. And that has been, in a lot of ways, I think a lot of the pushback is that any sort of talks about either cultural Christianity or whether the nation should submit to Christ, these are all reactions to this negative world that we find ourselves in. I'm curious what you've in the time since we've talked, because that's been over half a year now. Have you seen this conversation moving ahead insofar as people are not only grappling with kind of where we are, as far as, I know I'm stealing from Ren's kind of negative world conception, but however we want to frame that, is this an actual helpful way of understanding where we are, or are people still interpreting this as some sort of reactionary move by Christians who are grappling with kind of a new set of rules, a new playing field that they're on?
Yeah, I think it's a necessary conversation, because certainly, post Obergefell, the way that marriage has been redefined, the culture is being redefined. I think there are new challenges that are there. I mean, even in the last number of weeks, since October 7th, when Hamas invaded Israel and some of the things that are going on here, that seems to have actually kind of put a hole in the multicultural project that is just assumed today. I mean, in my, again, county here today, we have students who are planned walkout to support Palestine. And it's like, that's very, very different world than it was, let's say, in the 1950s, because immigration policies have changed in the 1960s. So some of that, that culture of Christianity in the past that informed just the way that, holidays were celebrated, the way that things were done in the culture is different. So we are having to have that kind of conversation. And for many Baptists, I do think this is not, universal, but for many, they have talked often about religious liberty, but maybe not so much about what actually leads to that liberty. And so then some are wanting to say, well, we need to enforce that. We need to enforce that kind of Christianity that is there, maybe, or maybe we need to think about the way that it actually, we need to impact culture. So that was the conversation with Andrew Sandlin and Joe Boot, again, talking about the fact that laws and even politicians who are writing those laws, enforcing those laws, are downstream from the culture. And I would argue that culture is downstream from religion. Who is it that we're actually worshiping in our country?
Right.
That today, if there was a kind of, quasi understanding of Christianity as the baseline religion in 1776, 1787, that today there still is a religion that is behind what is going on in so many places in government. It just happens to be the religion of sexual liberation, not religious liberty. So there are a number of different things that we're having to work through. And so there are multiple conversations that are happening. Some seem to be better than others, and some are more equipped for those conversations than others. And so you're asking me all these questions like, man, I'm still trying to learn a number of these things along the way. And I've been far more comfortable in the questioner's chair for Christ over all this last month, and trying to help to think through these things, because ultimately at a practical level, pastors do need to have a better understanding of these things. Pastors need to have a biblical understanding of nationhood. They need to have a growing understanding of church and state, of the role of the government, what role they play in a public witness. That was one of the things that Dr. Mohler will talk about, is the necessity for the church to actually engage in public witness. And I just think that hasn't been taught enough or encouraged enough in many places today.
Yeah. That's why I found the conversation with Tom Askell just so encouraging. Tom has that just plain spoken but very wise counsel. And two of the things he said that stuck out to me was, number one, just the simple fact of not separating Christ from state, which I think for many Christians is helpful to think through. That, number one, we don't run to the state to solve problems. I'm not dependent on the laws of the land solving anything, and yet at the same time, I'm not going to allow the state, the nation to spiral without calling those leaders to account. They are under Christ. Just very simple but very powerful for Christians to think through. But then the second thing Tom pointed out that I thought was helpful was, it's okay to grapple with things where we have not flexed muscles previously. So, Tom was bringing up, since 2020, many of us had to work through some major muscles that we had not flexed before, and we were very helped by many voices in the past of Christian history that could be of help to us, men and women who had gone through these things before. But that's what I sense Christ overall trying to do here is just admit we need some growth in this area. We're not alone. This is not the first time we've gone through this, but it's been very helpful, kind of flexing some of those muscles. Yeah. Let me ask you this, David. So thinking of the reactionaries, because there's been some reactions on both sides. I'm wondering how we grapple with the term. And again, I know a lot of these questions are going to be things you guys are working through at Christ Overall. As you said, you guys still have this ongoing project. But for many, the reaction to these things has been, much the same as they would probably point to the early church and say Christian was it was a label of looking down on someone it was a label enforced on them, but they owned the label. Is that a helpful way to approach Christian nationalism? Is it helpful for those who say, I don't want the label, but I'm going to go ahead and own it anyway? What are your thoughts initially?
Yeah, I mean, the irony of all of it is, to those who are using that term the most, probably those kind of in the leftward progressive media who look down on Christians, whether they take that term or not, that's what they continue to use, right? And so the anti-Christian nationalists are still going to be called Christian nationalists because they dare to believe the Bible and to speak about Christ in public spaces. Right. So many of them have said, well, if they're going to call us that, well, then we'll be able to use it. I mean, I appreciate what Doug Wilson has said, that it's a term that he can use because in less than 3 minutes, he can define what he means by it. Right. That he is a Christian. He believes in the nation. He wants to see that nation influenced by Christianity because Christianity is the true religion. And people flourish when they come to an understanding of Christ. And if there's an influence that is there, there's goodness in that. So I actually don't have a problem with an individual who wants to take that terminology. For me, I probably haven't taken that terminology because there are some questions that come into that. Someone asked, "Are you a Christian nationalist?" Well, I'm Christian nationalish. I just changed that P to an H, right? I mean, it's like that doesn't answer anything really, but it's like, yeah, I mean, I'm a Christian and someone who deeply cares about my nation. And I think that both of those are at work that is there. But I think the language of biblical nationhood seems to be more helpful because it's not confusing the language of Christianity or Christian and the nation, right? Certainly, when we talk about a Christian church, I believe that should be a regenerate church. Even those who would say that it's believers and their children are going to see that it's a covenant community, it's a covenant church that is there. That has to be different than a nation if you were to use the language of Christian for that nation. So there's equivocation on how that term is used. And some want to use that language so that Christian means the same thing in all places. And I can appreciate that. But I can also see how that word Christian can be equivocated. It can have slightly different nuances because when you talk about a Christian school, it's very possible that not every single member of the student body is a Christian, but it has a confession of faith, Lord willing, that they're using for what they're teaching, and people know what that means. Again, it gets more muddy when you get to a nation because different nations historically have used that in different ways. So all that to say, I'm not a huge opponent of those who want to take that label. That's not something that I'm going to be, leading with the way that I'm going to define myself in that. But when we get down to it, the issues and there's more content that we need to talk about than just the labels that are there.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, for anyone who's ever claimed a label, it's always hard because there's always those who claim the label who you're not in the same camp with. It's interesting though that you, coming from a Baptist perspective, I'm not trying to put you on the spot with this, but like coming from a Baptist perspective, if I'm hearing you right, you're saying that Christian can be both a noun and an adjective, and that's and correct me if I'm mishearing you, David, but like that's helpful to think through because at least from some voices, it has seemed that Christian can only be a noun. So we can't speak of things like Christian nations, or you brought up Christian schools, which I think that seems to be one most people are comfortable with, but that's confessing it can be an adjective that is describing something a little more than the individual regeneration of every member in that school. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to, again, allow how that word is being used, because I would say even the word Christian music industry maybe not be Christian at all, right? So, I mean, we certainly need to be able to think carefully about how that word is being used and the intention of how somebody is using it. And I think that just means that when somebody uses that term, right? I mean, this is true with, as a Baptist, someone comes to our church and says, "Hey, I'm a Christian." And then we begin to get to know them. No, you're not. Right. And so, I mean, that's one of the projects, even when, there's a large Christian culture, that there are many who think themselves to be Christian. Well, then the church's mission is actually to identify, no, you actually don't believe the gospel. You are not regenerate. You're not born again. And here's the reasons why for that.
Right. No, that's helpful. And it's helpful for those of us who have been frustrated by the lack of it being an adjective, or the lack of acceptance of it being an adjective, is when you look at things. There was recently, I can't remember his name and it doesn't much matter, but there was a professing Christian artist who went to the Dove Awards with a dress on, and people saw that and they said, that's not Christian music. Right. So, or some people would look at the laws of our land and say, though, this is not a Christian culture or Christian nation. The negative is usually acceptable enough. But when you talk about the positive, what is Christian music? What is a Christian culture? What would a Christian nation look like? It seems to be that's where the disconnect sometimes comes in. We're okay with saying something's not Christian. It gets a little more confusing, a little more nuanced when we talk about what is Christian. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, even the way that there's been a great support for Israel and the Jewish nation over these last few weeks, at the same time that some of the same arguments are being used against a Christian nation. So again, we need to define our terms. We need to see what people mean by that. I think at that point it becomes prudential. Is it the wisest way to speak about that? There are enough ways in which it can be confused. I think there are other ways that could be more helpful. But again, at least the way that Christ overall has been thinking about this is we're not coming out against Christian nationalists, so to speak, and being anti-Christian nationalists, nor are we taking up that label and making a defense for it.
Yeah. So, David, I want to land the plane because I have so many questions, but most of them are just about what you guys are about to be releasing in the next month,
Sure,
Christ
sure.
overall. So I don't want to steal it. What do you see encouraging though, as far as those who are doing good work in this area, those that people could follow, ministries or just individuals? And let me frame the question. I was reflecting. I saw you post on the Twitter or X. You'd posted it was a TGC article about, you know, the infamous one. Well, they've had a couple infamous ones, but the infamous one about Taylor Swift's Eras tour and, you know, the lessons. And I think they pulled that one if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah. Anyway, you posted that one or, you know, shared it and said, you know, maybe the biggest concern to evangelicalism isn't coming out of Moscow, Idaho, or something in that regard, which I thought was just spot on. It has seemed that in recent years there have been many voices, whether they're individuals or institutions, that not only don't seem to have any answers for where we are, but they don't seem to know the questions we're supposed to be asking. And that's been disconcerting for a lot of Christians. Where do you see some encouraging things, people that are doing good work in this area and helps for people that are navigating this?
Yeah, are you supposed to back me into the corner here to say that those in Moscow are doing the good work there? Yeah.
You did speak with them on your interview.
I did. Yeah.
I was encouraged to see that.
The only problem I have with Doug Wilson is he's not a Baptist.
He would agree with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the problem he has with me.
Right.
So, I mean, you know, I think what they have done has been helpful over these last number of years. And there have been a number who have kind of, you know, been upset that as a non-Baptist, he's also leading Baptists away from being Baptist. And I can appreciate that. And yet when he is addressing the issues of culture, I think that he does, and Canon Plus does, have a better grasp of some of the concerns of what's going on in our culture today than others who I might have more affinity with their biblical, theological presentation of how the scriptures go together, how the covenants work out. But I think that has been helpful. I think Aaron Wren has been helpful on those things as well. I'll tell you what, one of the articles that I read just thinking through a number of these things was by Josh Dawes. Josh Dawes, the article that he wrote for American Reformer, was really helpful to just kind of capture how some of these arguments are going today. That was doing kind of posturally what we're trying to do as well, to say, look, this is an important conversation. We're talking past each other in a number of ways. We need to understand how people are talking about these things, because all of us are grappling with some of the larger issues of a political theory and a political theology. So, I mean, I've been helped by American Reformer in that. I think they're doing some good work there. Don't agree with all the things that they would do. We had Timon Klein on, and he's a bit more of an establishmentarian on some of these things, but appreciative of what is going on. And in this way, I think this is a time of learning for all of us to say, what did our forefathers understand? Maybe we do need to spend the time going back to Samuel Rutherford and understanding how this works out, right? Glenn Sunshine, in his book, Slaying Leviathan, was incredibly helpful to say that there is a great history of political resistance that is there. And so I think those are things that we need to have a better understanding of.
Yeah. No, it's been encouraging just to see. I mean, just from the names you listed off at the front end of this show, just the variety of viewpoints and perspectives, and yet pulling together. You're not going to agree with everybody on everything, and yet what do they have that we can learn from? Glenn Sunshine's another. Glenn Sunshine wasn't on your interview list, was he?
No, I'd love to talk to him as well. At some point, we just had to say we can't talk to anymore. We had about a dozen or so, and had more that we'd love to talk to, and you know, we're finite, very finite.
Absolutely. Well, David, thank you so much for joining me again, brother. This is encouraging. I'm encouraged by the work coming out of Christ overall. I'm looking forward to the analysis. And again, even if people don't agree with you on everything, I hope they can learn from some of the things you guys have discovered. Eat the meat, spit out the bones, etc., and we can learn from one another and sharpen one another. So thank you guys for the work you guys are doing.
Hey, man, really appreciate it. Good to be with you today.
All right, brother.